have, as was articulated far better than I will be able to, the victories of the civil society, and I hope to go through them because there are several clashes where we have seen the attempt at corporatizing the society, the attempt to enforce and subjugate the society to the whims of private interest within Britain and the United States, and there have been significant victories that were fought for by Iraqi civil society, and I think that is one of the best directions for Tadhamun. And so also I wanted to talk about the struggle that is being waged here for legal reparations. It's happening in a very disparate way, but there is a real essential need for Iraqi diaspora to participate in this process as much as possible. They are already participating, but the more the better. And then, as the point that was made earlier, the idea of claiming for asylum. This is a point when if people have the linguistic capabilities, they are needed to assist lawyers on a daily basis to help really people who have suffered absolutely the most from these massive spectacles of war. You know, an industry has been created in this country since 2003 of colonial ventriloquism, of self-orientalization amongst Iraqi generations that come from backgrounds that were in some way exiled throughout the 80s. They were in situations when jobs were waiting for them to go and work, maybe Chatham House, maybe for the British government, maybe for the United States, maybe writing articles in The Guardian, extolling the achievements of democracy, as we will get into post-2003. The important thing for us to understand is that is in no way, shape or form solidarity with Iraq. You know, we have the example of Abdul Muhsin Sa'doun in the 30s, the Prime Minister, and what was some of his last words in his suicide letter that he wrote to his son? He wrote the suicide letter in Turkish. You know, he had been denounced as a traitor within the Iraqi parliament, and he was really bayn narayn. He was between two fires, in that between the fire of the Iraqi public, between the fire of the parliament, but also between the fire of the British government. And in his letter of suicide, he wrote, "Al-Umma tantadhar al-khidma wal-Inglis la yuwafiqun." This is an important lesson for all of the diasporic Iraqis that are living here today to know that as much as you may be tempted to take part in this type of institutional, incrementally and attritionally violent solidarity, this is not solidarity with Iraq, and it is a lesson that the generations before you have learned, and you must learn also. So, to go on to the victories of Iraqi civil society, which, you know, there's a lot of violence that has happened as a massive spectacle, and because of the magnitude of the violence that has been directed at Iraq, so much of the way we think about violence has focused on these massive spectacles. But a lot of the violence takes place on paper. And I think that in that invisible violence, the resistance to it and the victories of the resistance to it is also invisibilized. So we have three important victories for civil society. Number one was the failure to pass the oil law in 2007. Now this was pushed by the IMF, and what it essentially was hoping to do, as we will get into a little bit later, was almost indefinitely siphon off Iraqi oil to major companies, whether Shell, BP. You know, the contracts are still being signed, but the fact is, because of the mobilization of civil society, the political class, the parameters of their rationality were defined by the civil society, and still they haven't been able to pass it. The draft is still going back and forth from 2007 up until now. Very hilariously, when we think about the next one, another victory for the civil society was the passing of the labor law in 2015. As of 1986, strikes had been outlawed. Okay? Now surely if we think that you are instilling democracy into society, one of the vital columns of that democracy would be the right to collective bargaining and the right to striking. The law was not put in place until 2015, and again, that was thanks to the civil society, not out of the goodness of Salim Jabori's heart, mathalan. This was something that people had to fight for and mobilize for in a very important way. And the third important point against social conservatism was the victory in the failure of the amendments to the personal status law, not only in 2014, but also 2017. This was not, again, because parliamentarians felt this deeply, it was because people moved and forced that to happen. So if we look at the issue of the corporatization, and we see that it was actually something that was deeply kind of steering British and US thinking about Iraq prior to the occupation and thereafter. We know that oil accounts for between 95 to 99% of the government's revenue. Is estimated that there is 50 to 200 billion barrels yet to be discovered. The oil was fully nationalized in 1972, but there was an extent to which French and Chinese were later involved. We know that at that time the US was the largest consumer of oil in the world, and today is per capita the largest consumer, but not still the overall largest consumer. Alan Greenspan, the chairman for the Federal Reserve, said everyone knows, quote unquote, the Iraq war is largely about oil. This is the real importance of the oil law that we will get to. We look at Robert Abel, the State Department's senior pre-war advisor on Iraq war, said, what was it that Iraqis had that we would like to have? It wasn't sand. You had a telegram that was passed about by the British in October 2002, and it was the British ambassador in the United States. The title of the telegram was Iraq, Dividing the Spoils. Quote unquote, the UK will need to register with the Americans that in the event of war, the UK will expect to get a generous share of reconstruction and oil contracts after Saddam's defeat. That did not happen after the Gulf War. We see a letter from Jack Straw, and these are in presently declassified documents which previously were not available. Jack Straw said to Tony Blair, the long-term commercial opportunities in Iraq will be huge as a generation of neglected infrastructure is replaced. There were 5 meetings between BP and Shell and the British government in the lead up to the Iraq war that have now been declassified. There was talk of the big oil prospect. Trade Minister at the time, Baroness Simons, a Blairite and active member of the British-American project, which aimed since the 1980s to align British foreign policy with the US, had said in Parliament that Iraqi oil was the patrimony of the Iraqi people. She assured worried British companies, though, it would be difficult to justify British companies losing out in Iraq in that way if the UK had been a conspicuous supporter of the US government throughout this crisis. Both BP and Shell, prior to the declassifications of these documents, claimed that the meetings never happened. Now, the CEO of BP at that time was someone called Michael J. He met with Michael J., who was the permanent undersecretary of the Foreign Office, less than 48 hours before bombs started dropping on the 18th of March 2003. The head of BP and the most senior civil servant in the Foreign Office meeting together at this time. What were they discussing? It's important to know that of Michael J.'s 5 predecessors in that role, 4 became directors of oil and gas companies on retirement from government service. So we see this incestuous revolving door relationship between big business and important points of government. And one of the things that Dick Cheney actually told the former Russian Prime Minister was that, quote unquote, bids of those countries which cooperated with the US over Iraq would be looked at more sympathetically than those which did not. And of course, Kellogg Bruton Brown, a subsidiary of Dick Cheney's Halliburton, was awarded a $7 billion contract a week before the invasion. This is the largest no-bid contract in US history. There's a lot to go through. I don't want to take up too much time. But, the point is that we also even see, at one point, Tony Blair being rendered an ambassador to Siemens UK. So the UK branch of Siemens, the German telephone company, when he was put in a position where it seemed like the Americans were going to give a contract to General Electric. So what happened? Tony Blair was advised to proselytize for Siemens, on behalf of Siemens, to President Bush. And what happened? Within a month, the contract went to Siemens. And so this was considered a success story. This is kind of a rendering of politics as the entertainment sector of the destruction